My name is Dorothy Mae Richardson, and I'm 53 years old. At 2 in the morning, I stood in my daughter's kitchen, staring at my phone screen with trembling hands. The security footage showed everything. Derek, my son-in-law, slapping my daughter Hannah across the face once, twice, 3 times while his mother Constance stood behind him, actually clapping her hands and cheering him on like he'd just scored a touchdown. But this wasn't the first recording. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story hits close to home, or if you believe every mother should protect her child no matter what, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories of justice. Trust me, you won't believe what happened when I finally made that one phone call I swore I'd never make again. 2 years ago, Hannah's wedding to Derek Wellington looked like something out of a fairy tale. The ceremony cost more than most people's houses, held at the Wellington family estate with its perfectly manicured gardens and marble fountains. Derek came from old money, the kind that builds entire city blocks and puts family names on hospital wings. His family owned Wellington Development, which controlled half the commercial real estate in our town. When Hannah first brought Derek home, I wanted to like him. Really, I did. He was charming, successful, and seemed to worship the ground she walked on. But something felt off from the beginning. Maybe it was my 25 years as a family court mediator that made me notice the subtle signs. During wedding planning, Derek would interrupt Hannah's preferences, suggesting better choices that always happened to align with what his mother Constance wanted. When Hannah mentioned wanting a small, intimate ceremony, Derek would laugh and say, "My mother would never forgive us if we didn't do this properly." Constance Wellington made her feelings about Hannah crystal clear from day one, though she wrapped her cruelty in southern charm and backhanded compliments. "Bless your heart, Hannah, that dress is so unique," she'd say about anything Hannah picked out. The expensive gifts started immediately after the engagement. A designer purse here, a luxury vacation there, always accompanied by subtle reminders about how grateful Hannah should be for marrying into such a generous family. Each gift came with strings attached, unspoken expectations about how Hannah should dress, behave, and present herself as a Wellington wife. I watched my confident, independent daughter slowly transform into someone who second-guessed every decision, always checking with Derek first before expressing an opinion. My background in family court had taught me to recognize patterns of control and manipulation. I'd spent decades mediating custody disputes, restraining orders, and divorce proceedings. I knew what emotional abuse looked like, even when it wore expensive suits and came from respectable families. The Wellington name carried weight in our community. They were pillars of society, major donors to local charities, and regular features in the society pages. But I'd seen enough powerful families destroy people behind closed doors to know that money and status could hide terrible secrets. The isolation happened gradually. Derek convinced Hannah that her old friends were beneath her now, and that she needed to cultivate relationships with the right kind of people. Family dinners became less frequent because Derek always had some business dinner or social obligation that required Hannah's presence. When she did visit, Derek would call constantly, claiming emergencies at work that required her immediate return home. My daughter, who used to call me 3 times a week, started going weeks without contact. I'd retired early from my position as a family court mediator after working on a case that opened my eyes to just how deep corruption could run in our local judicial system. A prominent judge's son had been credibly accused of domestic violence, but evidence mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories, and the case fell apart. I'd built a reputation over 25 years for being fair but absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting victims of family violence. That case taught me that sometimes justice required going outside the local system entirely. I had connections with federal investigators, people who couldn't be bought or intimidated by local money and influence. That was the one call I'd promised myself I'd never have to make again, because it meant the local system had failed completely. But watching my daughter disappear into the Wellington family's control, seeing the light fade from her eyes during our increasingly rare visits, I started to worry that call might become necessary. Hannah had always been strong-willed and independent. Seeing her defer to Derek on everything, watching her apologize for opinions she used to express confidently, made my stomach turn. When I noticed the way she flinched when Derek raised his voice or how she constantly checked her phone for his messages, every instinct I'd developed over decades of working with abuse victims started screaming warnings. The final straw was when Hannah stopped coming to family gatherings altogether. Derek always had an excuse: Hannah was tired, feeling under the weather, or they had prior commitments with his family. When I called to check on her, Derek would answer her phone, explaining that Hannah was in the shower or taking a nap. The few times I did manage to speak with her directly, she sounded distant and distracted, always cutting conversations short because Derek needed her for something. That's when I made the decision to install those security cameras. The security cameras I'd secretly installed around Hannah's property captured everything in horrifying detail. Hours of footage showed a pattern of escalating abuse that made my blood run cold. Derek's violence wasn't random or heat of the moment, it was systematic, calculated, and encouraged by his mother. The specific incident that nearly broke me happened after they returned from a charity gala where Hannah had apparently embarrassed the family by talking too long with one of Derek's business rivals. Constance stood in their living room like a twisted coach, offering commentary while Derek slapped Hannah 3 times across the face. "That's what she gets for thinking she belongs with us," Constance said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "Maybe now she'll learn to keep her mouth shut and remember her place." Hannah's quiet sobs while she held her reddened cheek haunted my dreams for weeks afterward. But what made it even worse was discovering this wasn't an isolated incident. The cameras captured multiple episodes of Derek's violence, with Constance often present, sometimes even instigating the attacks. Using my professional contacts from my years in family court, I started digging into the Wellington family's history. What I found made me physically sick. Derek had been expelled from 2 colleges for assault before his family's money and connections helped him transfer to a 3rd school where the records were conveniently sealed. I found court documents from 3 different states where young women had filed restraining orders against Derek, only to have the cases mysteriously dismissed or settled out of court with hefty non-disclosure agreements. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Constance had been married 3 times, and each of her previous husbands had died under questionable circumstances, leaving her their entire estates. Derek had been married once before Hannah, to a young woman named Jennifer who'd fled the state after only 6 months of marriage, leaving behind all her belongings and never speaking publicly about what happened. When I tried to track her down, I discovered she'd changed her name and moved across the country, refusing to talk to anyone about her time with Derek. The Wellington family's business practices were as corrupt as their personal lives. Wellington Development had a pattern of buying properties through shell companies, forcing out longtime residents through intimidation and legal harassment, then developing the land into luxury projects that gentrified entire neighborhoods. They'd been investigated multiple times for bid rigging, tax evasion, and environmental violations, but their political connections always seemed to make the investigations disappear. When I finally confronted Hannah with the evidence, showing her the security footage on my laptop, she broke down completely. The strong, confident daughter I'd raised had been replaced by a frightened shadow of herself. Through tears and trembling words, she confessed that Derek's violence had been escalating for months. It started with grabbing her arms too tightly during arguments, progressed to shoving and slapping, and recently included choking her until she nearly passed out. Hannah begged me not to call the police, explaining that Derek had convinced her no one would believe her word against his family's reputation. He'd also threatened that if she ever tried to leave or expose him, he would destroy both our lives using his family's money and connections. Constance had made it clear that Hannah was replaceable, just like Derek's previous wife, and that accidents could happen to people who caused problems for their family. But Derek discovered my involvement sooner than I expected. Hannah must have mentioned our conversation, because within 24 hours, my phone was ringing with threats from both Derek and Constance. Derek's voice was calm and controlled when he called, which made his words even more terrifying. He explained very matter-of-factly that I was interfering in his marriage and that if I continued, he would make sure I regretted it for the rest of my life. Constance's approach was more psychological. She started a whisper campaign throughout our community, suggesting that I was having mental health problems since my retirement. She told people at the country club and church that I was becoming obsessed with Derek and Hannah's marriage, making up stories about abuse because I couldn't accept that my daughter had married above her station. Within days, longtime friends were looking at me with concern and pity, asking if I was taking care of myself and suggesting I might need professional help. The Wellington family's influence in our town became clear as they turned the community against me. They painted me as a bitter, vindictive mother-in-law who couldn't accept her daughter's happiness with a successful man. Local business owners who'd known me for decades suddenly became cold and distant. Even my own neighbors started avoiding me, convinced by the Wellingtons' carefully crafted narrative that I was becoming dangerously unhinged. The Wellington family's counterattack was swift and devastating. Derek filed false police reports claiming I was stalking him and Hannah, providing evidence in the form of photos showing me parked near their house and following them to public places. Of course, he failed to mention that I was there because I was genuinely concerned for my daughter's safety. The police took his complaints seriously because of his family's standing in the community and their generous donations to the local police benevolent fund. Constance launched a more insidious campaign, spreading rumors about my mental state throughout our social circles. She told people at the garden club that I'd been calling Hannah dozens of times a day, showing up unannounced at all hours, and making increasingly wild accusations about Derek. She shared concerns about my emotional stability since retiring, suggesting that losing my professional purpose had sent me into a spiral of paranoid delusions about my daughter's marriage. The professional sabotage hit me where it hurt most. I'd been doing consulting work for other family court mediators, helping with particularly complex cases that required my expertise. Suddenly, those referrals dried up completely. Colleagues who'd respected my work for decades started declining my calls. When I finally confronted one of them directly, she admitted that she'd been told I was going through some personal issues, and that it might be best to give me space until I got the help I needed. My reputation, built over 25 years of professional excellence, crumbled in a matter of weeks. The Wellingtons had weaponized my own community against me, turning my concern for my daughter into evidence of mental instability. The worst part was watching Hannah be forced to participate in their campaign. Derek made her call me to request that I stop harassing them, and I could hear him coaching her in the background about what to say. The charity gala incident was a carefully orchestrated trap designed to publicly destroy whatever credibility I had left. The Wellington Foundation's annual fundraiser was the social event of the year, and I'd attended many times in the past as a respected member of the community. This time, I went specifically to gather evidence, hoping to catch Derek and Constance off guard in a public setting where they might reveal their true nature. I should have known it was a setup the moment I arrived. The security guards were expecting me, positioned strategically throughout the venue like they were guarding against a known threat. I managed to mingle for about 30 minutes, trying to observe Derek and Hannah's interactions, when Constance approached me with a concerned expression that I now realize was completely fake. "Dorothy, dear, I'm so worried about you," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Hannah told me you've been having such a difficult time lately. Are you sure you should be here tonight?" Before I could respond, she started sharing fabricated stories about my supposed erratic behavior, speaking in the tone of someone genuinely concerned about a friend's mental health crisis. Derek joined the performance, expressing fake sympathy for my condition, while subtly suggesting that my presence at the gala was inappropriate and potentially dangerous. He mentioned my obsession with their marriage and how concerned he was about Hannah's safety. Other guests started staring, whispering among themselves about the dramatic scene unfolding in the middle of their elegant evening. The humiliation reached its peak when security approached me, politely but firmly explaining that I needed to leave immediately. Derek had apparently filed a restraining order that morning, claiming I'd threatened him and his family. The legal document was served to me right there in front of 200 of our community's most prominent citizens, complete with photography by someone who just happened to have their phone ready to capture the moment. The video of my meltdown at the charity gala went viral on local social media within hours. Of course, the footage was carefully edited to show only my emotional reaction to being publicly humiliated, not the context of Derek and Constance's orchestrated performance that led to my breakdown. I looked exactly like what they wanted people to see, an unstable woman making a scene at a respectable community event. Hannah was forced to give a statement to the local newspaper, expressing her sadness about my mental health struggles and requesting privacy while their family dealt with this difficult situation. Reading my own daughter's words condemning me in print felt like being stabbed in the heart. I knew Derek had written every word, but seeing Hannah's name attached to statements about my concerning behavior and need for professional help nearly broke me entirely. The restraining order prohibited me from coming within 500 feet of Derek, Hannah, or any Wellington property. Since the Wellingtons owned half the commercial buildings in town, this effectively banned me from most of downtown, including my bank, my doctor's office, and my favorite restaurants. The legal document painted me as a dangerous stalker who'd been harassing a young couple trying to build their life together. My first near-defeat moment came that night, alone in my house, reading the cruel comments on social media from people I'd known for years. Former friends and neighbors were sharing the video of my public humiliation, adding their own commentary about how they'd always known something was off about me. The isolation was complete and devastating. Even my own sister called to suggest that maybe I should consider getting some professional help, because she was starting to worry about my mental state too. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me came from the person I trusted most, Judge Patricia Morrison, my closest friend and former colleague. Patricia and I had worked together for 15 years, sharing cases and supporting each other through the most difficult situations family court could throw at us. I'd been her daughter's godmother, she'd been the maid of honor at my wedding, and I'd trusted her with my deepest secrets and fears about Hannah's situation. When Patricia called requesting a private meeting at her home, I thought she was finally going to offer the support I desperately needed. Instead, she sat me down in her living room with the expression of someone about to deliver a terminal diagnosis and confessed that she'd been feeding information about my investigation to the Wellington family for months. The betrayal was so complete and unexpected that I initially thought I'd misheard her. "Dorothy, you have to understand," Patricia said, her voice shaking with what I initially mistook for remorse. "The Wellingtons have been paying me for years. Not just me, half the judges in this district, the police chief, the district attorney's office. Derek's family doesn't just have money, they have a system." She explained that the corruption ran deeper than I'd ever imagined, stretching back decades and involving everyone from local politicians to state representatives. The revelation about my retirement case hit me like a physical blow. I'd left my career because a judge's son had escaped consequences for domestic violence, and I believed it was an isolated incident of corruption. Patricia laughed bitterly when I mentioned it, explaining that the case had been managed from the beginning by the same network that was now protecting Derek. My years of believing I was fighting for justice had been an illusion, the system had been rigged the entire time. Patricia's threats were delivered with the cold efficiency of someone who'd clearly made these kinds of deals before. If I didn't back down immediately and stop investigating the Wellington family, she would file charges against me for harassment, stalking, and making false accusations against upstanding community members. She had enough influence in the local courts to make sure I'd be convicted, regardless of the evidence or lack thereof. But the security footage I'd been collecting revealed horrors that went far beyond simple domestic violence. The latest recordings showed Derek sexually assaulting Hannah while she was unconscious from what appeared to be drugs in her drink. Constance was present during the assault, not just watching but offering suggestions and guidance like she was coaching Derek through a particularly difficult golf swing. The level of cruelty and calculated evil was beyond anything I'd encountered in my professional career. This wasn't Derek's first time engaging in this behavior. I found evidence suggesting that his previous wife Jennifer had endured similar treatment before fleeing the state. The pattern was becoming clear. Derek and Constance worked together to systematically break down their victims, using a combination of physical violence, psychological manipulation, and sexual assault to maintain complete control. Jennifer's sudden departure and refusal to ever speak about her marriage made perfect sense in this context. The Wellingtons' escalation tactics became more aggressive as they realized I wasn't backing down despite their previous successes. Derek's violence against Hannah intensified dramatically, with the security cameras capturing him choking her until she lost consciousness during arguments. Constance moved into their house permanently, claiming she wanted to help the young couple through this difficult time, but actually positioning herself to monitor and control Hannah's every movement. The restraining order against me was just the beginning of their legal warfare. I received notice that I was being served with additional court documents almost daily, civil lawsuits for defamation, harassment claims, and even a petition claiming I was mentally incompetent and needed to be placed under guardianship for my own protection. Each legal filing was designed not just to silence me, but to drain my resources and mental energy fighting bogus claims. My house became a target for increasingly aggressive harassment. Someone spray painted, "Crazy," and "Leave them alone" across my garage door in red letters that looked like blood. My mailbox was destroyed 3 times, my car tires were slashed, and rocks were thrown through my windows with notes attached threatening worse violence if I didn't stop interfering. The police responded to my calls about vandalism with barely concealed annoyance, clearly believing the Wellington narrative that I was bringing these problems on myself. The community manipulation reached new heights as the Wellingtons used their charitable foundation and social connections to completely isolate me. Local businesses that had served me for years suddenly found reasons why they couldn't accommodate me anymore. My grocery store, my pharmacy, even my hair salon started treating me like a pariah. The Wellington Foundation issued a statement expressing concern about my mental health and suggesting that community members give me space while I got the help I needed. Local media coverage painted me as increasingly unhinged and dangerous. The newspaper ran a series of articles about how to recognize warning signs of dangerous mental illness in community members, with descriptions that clearly matched the false narrative the Wellingtons had created about me. They interviewed concerned neighbors, who shared fabricated stories about my erratic behavior and growing instability. Even my own sister turned against me during this period. Emma called to stage what she presented as an intervention, bringing along Patricia and 2 other longtime friends to convince me that I needed psychiatric help. They'd clearly been coached by someone about what to say, because they all used nearly identical language about my paranoid delusions and obsessive behavior regarding Hannah's marriage. When I tried to show them the security footage, they refused to look at it, claiming that my willingness to secretly record my daughter proved how far my mental illness had progressed. The isolation was complete and devastating. Every support system I'd ever had was either corrupted, intimidated, or convinced that I was dangerously mentally ill. Hannah had been completely cut off from me, her phone and internet access monitored so closely that I couldn't even send her a message without Derek knowing about it. My resources were being drained by constant legal battles, my reputation was in ruins, and my own family was convinced I needed institutional care. Despite feeling completely isolated and under constant attack, my years of experience in family court had taught me to think strategically even in the darkest circumstances. I began using my knowledge of legal procedures and evidence gathering to build a case that could withstand the Webster's corruption and influence. Working from my home computer, I created encrypted files documenting every piece of evidence I'd collected, backed up in multiple locations that the Wellingtons couldn't access or destroy. The financial evidence I uncovered revealed the true scope of the Wellington family's criminal enterprise. Their real estate development business was essentially a money laundering operation for organized crime, using complex shell companies and fraudulent construction contracts to clean dirty money from drug trafficking and human smuggling operations. Bank records showed millions of dollars flowing through accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, hidden from federal tax authorities through an elaborate network of fake businesses and overseas investments. I reached out to Derek's previous victims who had been paid to stay silent, tracking them down through court records and private investigators I hired with what remained of my savings. 3 women agreed to speak with me confidentially, sharing horrifying stories of abuse that matched Hannah's experiences exactly. They'd all been isolated from their support systems, systematically broken down through violence and psychological manipulation, and threatened with financial ruin or physical harm if they ever spoke publicly about their experiences. Building a network of allies outside the local corruption ring required careful planning and absolute discretion. I contacted colleagues in neighboring jurisdictions who hadn't been compromised by Wellington money, sharing evidence with family court mediators and victim advocates who could document the patterns I'd discovered. These professionals helped me understand that what I was dealing with was larger than just one abusive family. It was an organized network that specialized in exploiting and controlling women. But the Wellingtons' financial warfare against me was devastating and comprehensive. They used their connections to get me fired from my consulting position, convincing the agency that hiring me created liability issues due to my mental health problems and pending legal troubles. My main source of income disappeared overnight, just as my legal expenses were mounting from fighting their bogus lawsuits and court filings. The attack on my assets was methodical and brutal. Wellington Development filed a lawsuit claiming that work I'd done years earlier as a mediator in a case involving their properties had been biased and incompetent, demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. They convinced my mortgage company to accelerate my loan payments, claiming that my legal troubles made me a high-risk borrower. My credit cards were mysteriously canceled, my bank accounts were frozen pending investigation of suspicious activity, and my car was repossessed through a debt I'd never heard of before. The assault on my mental competency was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their campaign. They convinced my longtime doctor to question my psychological stability, providing him with carefully crafted reports about my recent behavior that painted me as increasingly paranoid and delusional. Dr. Williams, who'd been my physician for over a decade, started treating me like a psychiatric patient rather than someone seeking medical care, asking probing questions about my mental state and suggesting I might benefit from antipsychotic medications. The fake reconciliation trap was a masterpiece of manipulation that I almost didn't recognize in time. Derek and Constance reached out through Patricia, claiming they were concerned about my mental health and wanted to arrange family therapy sessions to resolve our conflicts. They suggested meeting at a private psychiatric facility that specialized in family interventions, presenting it as a neutral location where we could work through our differences with professional guidance. The facility they'd chosen was actually a private psychiatric hospital that specialized in involuntary commitments for wealthy families dealing with difficult relatives. The plan was to have me declared mentally incompetent during what I thought would be a therapy session, with pre-signed commitment papers and a doctor who'd already been briefed about my dangerous delusions. If I'd attended that meeting, I would have been institutionalized indefinitely, with Derek gaining legal guardianship over both me and Hannah. I only discovered the trap because I'd started researching everything connected to the Wellington family. The facility had a history of housing inconvenient relatives for wealthy families, keeping them sedated and isolated until they either died or were completely broken psychologically. Patricia's insistence that I attend the session alone, without legal representation, was the final red flag that made me realize this was another setup designed to destroy me permanently. Hannah's desperate cry for help came through a method that nearly broke my heart. She'd managed to hide a note inside a book she returned to the library, knowing that I volunteered there and would eventually find her message. The note revealed that she was pregnant and terrified about what Derek and Constance would do to both her and the baby. She'd overheard them discussing plans to take the child away from her immediately after birth, claiming she was mentally unstable and unfit for motherhood. The pregnancy added a horrifying new dimension to the situation. Hannah's note explained that Derek had become even more violent since learning about the baby, convinced that the pregnancy was somehow my fault or part of a plan to trap him in the marriage. Constance had started discussing boarding schools and private adoption agencies, making it clear that she intended to raise the child herself while keeping Hannah around as little more than a domestic servant. Time was running out in ways I hadn't fully appreciated. Hannah's note included details about conversations she'd overheard between Derek and Constance about permanent solutions to the problems I was causing. They'd grown tired of the legal and financial warfare, and were considering more direct methods of silencing me. The same people who'd made Derek's previous wife disappear were apparently being consulted about my situation. My second near-defeat moment came when I realized how completely they'd destroyed my life. I was facing involuntary psychiatric commitment, had no income or assets left to fight them with, and my own family believed I was dangerously mentally ill. Hannah was completely unreachable, pregnant, and in more danger than ever. My evidence would be meaningless if I was locked away in a psychiatric facility, and there seemed to be no one left who was both willing and able to help us. The moment I almost gave up completely came at 3 a.m, sitting in my nearly empty house with foreclosure notices spread across my kitchen table. I'd lost everything I'd worked for my entire life, my daughter was trapped in an escalating nightmare, and a grandchild I might never meet was in danger. The rational part of my mind was telling me that the Wellingtons had won, that continuing to fight would only make things worse for everyone involved. It would have been so easy to just surrender, to accept defeat and try to salvage whatever scraps of my former life remained. The ultimate betrayal came from my own sister Emma, the last person I thought I could trust. Emma had always been the practical one in our family, the sister who stayed out of drama and focused on her own quiet life. When she called asking to meet for coffee to discuss my situation, I thought she was finally going to offer the family support I desperately needed. Instead, she delivered the most devastating confession I could have imagined. Emma had been working with the Wellingtons for months, feeding them information about my activities, my emotional state, and my investigation into Derek and Constance. The confession came pouring out of her like poison she'd been holding inside, explaining that she owed the Wellingtons over $50,000 from her gambling addiction that I'd never known about. They'd discovered her debt and offered her a choice: help them monitor and control me, or face financial ruin and potential criminal charges for embezzling money from her employer to fund her casino visits. The depth of her betrayal was staggering. Emma had been accessing my private files during her visits to my house, photographing documents and evidence I'd collected about the Wellington family. She'd been reporting on my phone conversations, my meeting schedules, even my emotional state and sleeping patterns. Every piece of information I'd shared with her in confidence had gone straight to Derek and Constance, giving them advance warning about my every move. Emma's access to my personal information had enabled the Wellingtons to stay one step ahead of me constantly. They knew which lawyers I was consulting with, what evidence I'd gathered, and which allies I was trying to cultivate. My sister had essentially been functioning as their spy inside my own family, providing them with intelligence that made their psychological warfare devastatingly effective. The frame job that finally landed me in jail was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. Emma had helped them plant evidence in my home during a supposed wellness check, providing them with access to hide falsified financial documents that made it appear I'd been embezzling money from my former employer. The evidence was sophisticated enough to fool casual inspection, but clearly fabricated to anyone who understood financial records well enough to examine them closely. My arrest happened on a quiet Tuesday morning while I was having coffee and reading the newspaper. 6 police officers surrounded my house, treating me like a dangerous criminal as they handcuffed me in my own driveway while neighbors watched from their windows. The charges were serious: embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering, with bail set at an amount I couldn't possibly afford. The local news cameras were conveniently positioned to capture my humiliation as I was led away in handcuffs. The 3 days I spent in county jail were among the most terrifying of my life. Other inmates had seen the news coverage of my arrest, and the Wellingtons had made sure the story painted me as someone who stole money from domestic violence victims. In jail, there's nothing lower than someone who hurts vulnerable women and children. I was attacked on my second day by 3 women who thought they were delivering justice to a child abuser. The guards seemed remarkably slow to respond, and I spent that night in the medical unit with bruised ribs and a black eye. My court-appointed lawyer revealed himself to be another Wellington asset during our first meeting. Instead of discussing my defense, he spent the time trying to convince me to accept a plea bargain that would send me to prison for 5 years in exchange for avoiding a trial that would embarrass my family even more. He made it clear that fighting the charges would only result in additional evidence being discovered and more serious charges being filed against me. The revelation that the entire local justice system was corrupted hit me with devastating force. Every judge, prosecutor, and defense attorney I'd worked with during my career was either directly compromised by Wellington money or too intimidated to stand up against their influence. The legal system I'd dedicated my life to serving had become a weapon being used to destroy me and protect my daughter's abusers. Local news coverage of my arrest was brutally one-sided, painting me as a disgraced former mediator who'd stolen money from the very people she was supposed to help. They interviewed victims who claimed I'd taken bribes to influence their cases, though I'd never seen any of these people before in my life. The narrative was that my concern for Hannah's marriage had been a cover story to distract from my own criminal activities that were finally being exposed. Hannah was forced to give a statement to the media expressing her shock and disappointment about my arrest. Standing next to Derek and speaking in a hollow voice that didn't sound like my daughter at all, She read from a prepared statement about how devastated she was to learn about my criminal activities. She claimed that my accusations against Derek had been projection, an attempt to deflect attention from my own illegal behavior. Watching my daughter denounce me on television while standing next to her abuser felt like having my heart ripped from my chest. My moment of complete despair came on my third night in jail, lying on a thin mattress in a cell that smelled of disinfectant and human misery. I'd lost everything: my career, my reputation, my family, my freedom, and my daughter. The Wellingtons had systematically destroyed every aspect of my life while positioning themselves as the victims of my obsessive behavior. Hannah was trapped with her abuser, pregnant and more vulnerable than ever, while I was facing years in prison for crimes I didn't commit. The investigation into the bigger picture began to emerge through conversations with my cellmate, a woman named Sarah who'd been arrested for prostitution but had actually been trying to escape a human trafficking ring. She recognized the Wellington name when I mentioned them, explaining that their real estate properties were used as fronts for moving trafficked women through our region. The scope of their criminal enterprise was far larger than just domestic abuse and financial corruption. Sarah's information revealed connections between the Wellingtons' real estate business and organized crime networks that specialized in human trafficking, drug distribution, and money laundering. Their legitimate businesses provided cover for moving illegal goods and people throughout the Southeast, using construction sites and rental properties as temporary housing for victims being transported to other locations. Several women had disappeared after being housed in Wellington properties, with their disappearances never properly investigated due to the family's influence over local law enforcement. The realization that Hannah might be murdered if I couldn't find a way to stop them gave me a new surge of desperate energy. The Wellingtons had killed before to protect their secrets, and my daughter's pregnancy made her a liability they might decide to eliminate permanently. If they could make me disappear into the prison system and discredit me completely, Hannah would have no one left to advocate for her or even notice if something happened to her. The evidence that several women had disappeared after crossing the Wellington family became clear through Sarah's connections to other trafficking victims. Jennifer, Derek's previous wife, might not have escaped successfully after all. Two other women who'd been in relationships with Wellington family members had vanished without explanation, their disappearances explained away as voluntary departures to start new lives elsewhere. But none of them had ever contacted family members again, and none had used their social security numbers or bank accounts after leaving town. My salvation came from an unexpected source: Agent Marcus Thompson from the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. Marcus had been my partner on the federal case that led to my early retirement, the investigation that exposed judicial corruption involving a judge's son. He reached out through Sarah's lawyer, someone who specialized in representing trafficking victims and had federal connections that couldn't be corrupted by local money and influence. Marcus explained that the FBI had been building a case against the Wellington criminal network for over 2 years, but they'd been struggling to find witnesses willing to testify and evidence that couldn't be dismissed or destroyed by the family's legal team. My documentation of Derek's abuse, combined with the financial evidence I'd gathered about their money laundering operations, provided missing pieces of a much larger puzzle they'd been working to solve. The federal investigation had identified the Wellingtons as a significant hub in a regional criminal network that used real estate development as cover for human trafficking, drug distribution, and weapons smuggling. Their legitimate businesses provided perfect cover for moving illegal goods and people throughout the Southeast, with construction sites serving as temporary holding locations and rental properties being used to house trafficked victims during transport. Derek's pattern of abuse wasn't just personal pathology, it was part of a systematic operation to identify and control women who could be useful to their criminal enterprise. His previous relationships had been carefully chosen based on the women's vulnerability, family connections, and potential value as either victims or unwitting accomplices. Hannah had been targeted specifically because of my background in family court, which could have provided valuable intelligence about law enforcement activities if she'd been successfully compromised. Connecting with Derek's previous victims required careful coordination to protect them from retaliation while gathering evidence that could stand up in federal court. The 3 women I'd contacted earlier agreed to work with federal investigators under witness protection protocols, sharing detailed accounts of abuse that established clear patterns of criminal behavior extending back over a decade. Jennifer, Derek's previous wife, was alive but living under an assumed identity in witness protection after escaping the Wellingtons with federal help. Her testimony provided crucial evidence about the family's criminal operations, including details about murder-for-hire arrangements they'd used to eliminate threats to their organization. She'd witnessed Derek and Constance planning the deaths of 2 business rivals who'd discovered their trafficking operations. Building the case required evidence that could withstand challenges from the Wellingtons' expensive legal team and their corrupt local allies. Federal investigators had been using surveillance technology and financial analysis tools that the family couldn't detect or influence. Banking records from overseas accounts, wiretapped conversations between family members, and digital evidence from their computer systems provided an unshakable foundation for prosecution. The first victory came when federal agents raided Wellington development offices and properties simultaneously across 3 states. Over 200 agents executed search warrants at the same moment, preventing the family from destroying evidence or coordinating their response. The raids uncovered massive amounts of physical evidence, financial records, computer files, weapons, drugs, and even 2 women who were being held against their will at a construction site outside town. Derek and Constance were arrested at their home while I was still in jail, charged with racketeering, money laundering, human trafficking, and multiple counts of assault and sexual abuse. Federal marshals took them into custody, bypassing the corrupted local law enforcement entirely. The charges were serious enough to ensure they'd be held without bail, ending their ability to intimidate witnesses or coordinate retaliation against their victims. Hannah's rescue happened within hours of Derek's arrest. Federal agents and victim advocates went to the house to extract her safely, finding her locked in a bedroom with boarded-up windows and no access to communication devices. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and showed signs of recent physical abuse, but she was alive and the baby was healthy. Medical examinations provided additional evidence of Derek's violence that would support the federal charges against him. The community's awakening to the truth about the Wellington family was swift and dramatic. As federal evidence became public through court filings, people began to understand how completely they'd been manipulated by the family's propaganda campaign. Local media that had painted me as mentally ill and dangerous suddenly pivoted to covering the criminal charges and evidence of the Wellingtons' extensive criminal enterprise. My vindication came not just through the criminal charges against Derek and Constance, but through the revelation of how many people had been intimidated, threatened, or corrupted into participating in their campaign against me. Community members who'd turned their backs on me began reaching out with apologies and explanations about the pressure they'd faced to isolate me. Local business owners admitted they'd been threatened with economic retaliation if they continued serving me. The scope of the Wellingtons' criminal network shocked even federal investigators who'd been building the case for years. Their organization had been responsible for trafficking hundreds of women through our region, distributing drugs worth millions of dollars annually, and laundering money for criminal organizations across the Southeast. The family's legitimate businesses and charitable foundation had provided perfect cover for one of the largest criminal enterprises in the region's history. The trial preparation phase revealed the full scope of evidence federal investigators had gathered against the Wellington criminal organization. Months of wiretapped conversations captured Derek and Constance discussing murders they'd ordered, women they'd trafficked, and politicians they'd corrupted. Financial records showed the movement of tens of millions of dollars through their money laundering operation, with detailed documentation of bribes paid to judges, police officials, and local politicians. Hannah's testimony became the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Despite the trauma she'd endured, she found the strength to tell her story in vivid detail, describing the systematic abuse she'd suffered and the terror of being completely isolated from help. Her account of Derek's violence, supported by medical evidence and security footage, painted a picture of calculated cruelty that shocked even experienced federal prosecutors. Multiple victims came forward during the trial preparation, creating an overwhelming body of evidence about the family's criminal activities. Derek's pattern of targeting vulnerable women became clear through testimony from 12 different victims spanning 15 years. Each woman told similar stories of isolation, abuse, and threats designed to keep them silent about the family's criminal activities. Constance's role as the mastermind behind many of the family's operations surprised investigators who'd initially focused primarily on Derek's violence. Wiretapped conversations revealed that she'd been planning and coordinating criminal activities for decades, using Derek and other family members as enforcers for her criminal enterprise. Her sophisticated understanding of money laundering and human trafficking suggested extensive experience in organized crime. The trial itself drew national media attention as details about the Wellingtons' crimes became public. Testimony revealed connections to criminal organizations across multiple states, with evidence showing their involvement in everything from political corruption to contract killings. The scope of their criminal enterprise rivaled organized crime families that had been operating for generations. Derek's breakdown on the witness stand provided one of the most dramatic moments of the trial. Under aggressive cross-examination about his violence against Hannah and other victims, he lost control completely, screaming threats at his own lawyers and attempting to attack federal prosecutors. His display of uncontrolled rage provided jurors with a clear demonstration of the violent temperament his victims had described in their testimony. Constance attempted to maintain her dignified facade throughout most of the trial, presenting herself as a grieving mother whose son had been corrupted by outside influences. But when confronted with recordings of her own voice ordering murders and coordinating trafficking operations, her carefully constructed image crumbled completely. She began ranting about how ungrateful her victims had been and how they deserved everything that happened to them. The financial evidence presented during the trial revealed the staggering scope of the Wellingtons' criminal profits. Federal analysts testified that the family had laundered over $50 million through their real estate business in just the past 5 years. Their criminal enterprise had been generating more money than many legitimate corporations, all while maintaining the facade of being respectable community leaders. Constance's desperate final measures included attempting to intimidate jurors through private investigators who followed them to their homes and workplaces. Federal marshals had to provide protection for jury members after evidence emerged of plans to threaten their families if they voted to convict. Her willingness to attack the jury itself demonstrated the lengths she'd go to protect her criminal empire. The trial's final confrontation occurred when Constance attempted to attack Hannah in the courthouse hallway during a recess. Despite being handcuffed and escorted by federal marshals, she broke free and lunged at my daughter with an improvised weapon she'd somehow concealed. My protective instincts kicked in completely as I stepped between them, willing to take whatever damage she intended for Hannah. The physical altercation lasted only seconds before marshals subdued Constance, but it provided a final, definitive demonstration of her violent nature and complete lack of remorse for her crimes. She screamed at Hannah about ungrateful victims and how they should have appreciated the privilege of serving the Wellington family. Her attack on a pregnant trafficking victim in front of federal agents and court personnel sealed her fate with jurors who'd been watching the proceedings. Derek and Constance being led away in handcuffs represented not just personal justice for Hannah and me, but victory for hundreds of victims whose suffering had finally been acknowledged and punished. The image of these two people who'd seemed so powerful and untouchable being reduced to common criminals in orange jumpsuits provided a satisfaction that went beyond personal revenge. Justice was finally served through sentences that reflected the scope of their crimes. Derek received 15 years in federal prison for assault, sexual abuse, and racketeering, with additional state charges pending in 3 other jurisdictions. Constance's 20-year sentence for conspiracy, money laundering, and witness intimidation ensured she'd spend the rest of her productive life behind bars, unable to hurt anyone else. The seizure of Wellington assets provided justice for their victims in practical terms as well. Federal authorities confiscated all family properties, bank accounts, and business interests, with the proceeds being distributed to victims as restitution for the trauma and losses they'd suffered. The Wellington Foundation's charitable assets were redirected to legitimate organizations serving trafficking victims and domestic abuse survivors. My complete vindication came through federal acknowledgement that I'd been targeted by a criminal organization specifically because of my efforts to protect my daughter and expose their crimes. all charges against me were dismissed, my criminal record was expunged, and federal authorities publicly commended my courage in gathering evidence that helped bring down a major criminal enterprise. The legal system that had failed me so completely was forced to acknowledge that I'd been right about everything. The healing journey for both Hannah and me began the moment Derek and Constance were locked away, but recovery from systematic trauma takes time and patience. Hannah's physical healing was relatively straightforward, but the psychological damage from months of isolation, abuse, and terror required extensive therapy and support. Watching my strong, independent daughter slowly rediscover her voice and confidence was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Professional counseling helped Hannah understand that none of the abuse she'd suffered was her fault, despite the psychological manipulation that had convinced her otherwise. The trauma bonding and learned helplessness that Derek had deliberately cultivated took months to overcome, but gradually she began to reclaim the personality and spirit that had been systematically suppressed during her marriage. The birth of Hannah's baby brought joy and healing that we both desperately needed after so much darkness and trauma. Little Grace was born healthy and perfect, carrying no trace of her father's cruelty in her innocent features. Watching Hannah hold her daughter for the first time, seeing the fierce protectiveness and pure love in her eyes, reminded me of why I'd fought so hard to save them both. Hannah's decision to keep the baby despite everything Derek had done showed a strength and maturity that amazed me. She understood that Grace was innocent of her father's crimes and deserved to be loved unconditionally. The therapeutic process helped Hannah separate her daughter from the trauma of her conception, focusing on building a future filled with love rather than being trapped by the pain of the past. Rebuilding relationships within our family and community required careful navigation of forgiveness and accountability. Some people who'd turned against me during the worst period had been genuinely deceived by the Wellingtons' manipulation, while others had made cowardly choices to protect themselves rather than standing up for what was right. Learning to distinguish between victims and collaborators was crucial for my own emotional healing. My sister Emma's situation was particularly complex because her betrayal had been motivated by her own victimization through gambling addiction and financial exploitation. The Wellingtons had deliberately targeted her vulnerability and used it to turn her against me, making her both a perpetrator and a victim in their criminal scheme. Forgiveness was possible, but rebuilding trust required her to acknowledge the harm she'd caused and commit to addressing her addiction. Some relationships couldn't be salvaged despite explanations and apologies. People who'd eagerly participated in destroying my reputation, who'd taken satisfaction in my public humiliation, or who'd continued attacking me even after evidence of their error emerged didn't deserve continued access to my life. Setting boundaries about which relationships to rebuild was essential for protecting my mental health during recovery. Judge Patricia Morrison faced federal charges for her role in the corruption network, ultimately receiving a 5-year sentence and permanent disbarment from practicing law. Her betrayal had been particularly devastating because of our personal history, but learning about the scope of intimidation and corruption she'd faced helped me understand her choices without excusing them completely. Professional restoration took time, but my experience fighting the Wellington criminal organization ultimately enhanced my reputation rather than destroying it. Federal agencies and victim advocacy organizations sought my consulting services specifically because of my first-hand understanding of how organized crime networks operate and how they use corruption to protect themselves from accountability. My new career focus on helping abuse victims navigate systems that might be corrupted or intimidated by their abusers felt like a natural evolution of my life's work. Training other professionals to recognize signs of organized criminal influence in domestic abuse cases became a passion that gave meaning to the trauma I'd endured. Every woman I helped escape a dangerous situation honored Hannah's courage and my own struggle for justice. Personal growth through the experience taught me to trust my instincts about people and situations, even when those instincts conflicted with conventional wisdom or social pressure. My years of professional experience hadn't been wrong when they told me Derek was dangerous. I'd just underestimated the scope of the criminal organization protecting him. The importance of building networks outside local power structures became a crucial lesson I shared with other advocates and victims. The Wellingtons had been able to control me for so long precisely because I'd initially tried to work within systems they'd corrupted. Federal agencies and national organizations provided resources that couldn't be compromised by local money and influence. Learning to recognize the difference between isolated family violence and organized criminal activity helped me understand why traditional domestic abuse interventions had failed so completely. The Wellingtons weren't just an abusive family, they were a criminal organization that used abuse as one tool among many for controlling people and protecting their illegal activities. Never underestimating the lengths powerful people will go to protect their secrets became a hard-earned wisdom that guided my future work with victims. The Wellingtons had been willing to destroy lives, corrupt institutions, and commit murder to protect their criminal enterprise, demonstrating that evil truly has no limits when it faces exposure. The most important battle in my life had been fought for my daughter and granddaughter, but the victory extended far beyond our personal situation. Hundreds of trafficking victims gained freedom because of the evidence we'd helped federal investigators gather. Corrupt officials faced accountability for their crimes, and a major criminal network was dismantled permanently. Sometimes the greatest victories do come from the darkest moments, when ordinary people find extraordinary courage to fight impossible odds. A mother's love combined with professional knowledge and federal law enforcement resources proved capable of moving mountains and defeating enemies who'd seemed untouchable. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, especially when patient, methodical investigation builds cases strong enough to withstand any defense. The Wellingtons had controlled local systems for decades, but federal justice ultimately proved more powerful than their money and influence. The final scene of our story finds me holding baby Grace while Hannah sleeps peacefully in her own home, safe and free for the first time in years. Reflecting on the journey from that terrifying night when I first watched security footage of Derek's violence, I'm filled with quiet satisfaction knowing that we fought the good fight and won. The most important call I ever made connected us to allies who could deliver real justice, proving that sometimes the system works exactly as it should when good people refuse to give up. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to fight a system that seemed completely stacked against you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you believe every mother should protect her children no matter the cost. Subscribe for more stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when it matters most, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that justice is possible even in the darkest circumstances. Thank you for listening to our story, and remember that your voice and your vote matter when it comes to holding powerful people accountable for their crimes. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never give up fighting for the people you love.